The Last Supper. For millions it is simply a familiar biblical scene, the farewell meal of Jesus with his disciples before his suffering. Leonardo da Vinci's painting, the gospel verses, the church liturgies, all of these have shaped within us the image of a quiet dinner, filled with sorrow and the foreboding of an end. But what if there is something more hidden behind this story? What if it was not merely a meal, but an ancient spiritual rite? A mystical initiation capable of awakening the soul itself. Esoteric tradition claims that the Last Supper was a carefully orchestrated event in which every word, every gesture, every symbol carried profound hidden meaning. The bread and wine, the circle of disciples, the washing of feet, even the act of betrayal, all were part of a process that transformed the inner essence of those present, lifting them to a new level of awareness. Today, we will look beyond the familiar boundaries of church interpretation and attempt to see this event through the eyes of those who seek spiritual depth, those who understand that Jesus was not only a teacher of faith, but also a master of inner alchemy. We will uncover the hidden symbols and discover how they can revive the soul of each of us, even 2,000 years later. To understand the esoteric meaning of the Last Supper, we must first see the scene through the eyes of those who lived in that time. We find ourselves in Jerusalem. A spring evening, the city is filled with pilgrims. Preparations for Pesach, the ancient Jewish festival of the Exodus from Egypt, are underway. In small houses, oil lamps are lit. The streets are filled with the aroma of fresh bread and wine. Jesus, together with his disciples, gathers in an upper room that had been prepared in advance. It is a special place, hidden from the eyes of strangers, where time can be spent in stillness and intimacy. The Gospels describe this gathering as the Passover meal. For the Jewish people, it was a symbolic dinner filled with the memory of their ancestors' miraculous deliverance. But for Jesus, this night carried yet another, far deeper meaning. The participants were himself and his 12 disciples, his closest companions, with whom he had shared the years of his ministry. They had witnessed miracles, heard his parables, and seen healings and awakenings. But this evening, Jesus was not speaking to the crowds. He was speaking only to them, to those ready to hear what mattered most. In traditional Christianity, the Last Supper is understood as a farewell, the institution of the sacrament of the Eucharist, and the preparation for the Passion of the Cross. But the esoteric interpretation goes further. It sees in this meal a carefully designed spiritual ritual, where every element was a symbol and every gesture a key capable of unlocking the gates of consciousness. Outwardly, it was a simple Passover dinner. Inwardly, it was a moment of transition, when Jesus was guiding his disciples from one level of understanding to another. It was the night when they were to confront the very essence of the spiritual path, the mystery of inner death and new birth. In religious tradition, Jesus is seen primarily as the Savior who came to redeem the sins of the world. But through the lens of esotericism, we see not only a prophet and miracle worker, but also a master of inner awakening. He spoke to people in the language of symbols, parables, and images because he knew truth cannot be handed down directly. It can only be discovered within oneself. In the esoteric view, Jesus was not merely a bearer of spiritual knowledge, but also a conduit for the energy of the higher mind. He did not simply teach, he transmitted a state of being in which the soul begins to remember its true nature. His words often carried multiple layers of meaning, one for the crowds, another for his close disciples, and yet another, hidden, accessible only to those ready for inner initiation. The Last Supper was the culmination of this teaching. Jesus knew that his time in the physical body was drawing to an end. He was not simply instructing his disciples, he was preparing them for the next stage, life without his physical presence. It was as if he was passing on to them an inner flame, one that would ignite in each of them when the outer teacher was no longer there. For the esoteric seeker, the figure of Jesus is not merely an object of worship, but a model of the path. He demonstrated that a human being can unite with the source of divine power, and that the way to it lies through inner transformation, humility, and the awareness of one's spiritual nature. The Last Supper became the ritual in which this transmission of knowledge and energy reached its highest point. When we hear that the Last Supper was attended by Jesus and 12 disciples, we tend to take it as a simple fact. Yet in the esoteric tradition, there are no random numbers. The number 12 appears in countless spiritual and cosmic systems, and this is no coincidence. 12 is the number of wholeness and completion. It embodies both order and harmony. In the heavens, we see 12 signs of the zodiac, each reflecting a specific energy, a mode of consciousness, an archetype of the human soul. In the cycles of time, there are 12 months, 12 hours of day, and 12 of night. In mystical teachings, the number 12 often symbolizes the full spectrum of human experience that must be integrated in order to achieve true unity. If we view the disciples as esoteric symbols, each one represents a particular energy or aspect of the self. One embodies courage, another faith, another compassion, another wisdom, but among them are also those who carry doubt, fear, or even betrayal. This circle of 12 is like a mirror in which the seeker can see every facet of their own soul. At the center stands Jesus, the axis around which the circle revolves. He is the point of unity, the unmoving center where all opposites meet. In this sense, the Last Supper is not merely a meal, but a model of the cosmos itself, where center and circumference are bound together, and every part of the circle plays its role. Thus, the symbolism of the number 12 at the supper emphasizes that the spiritual path requires recognizing and reconciling all aspects of oneself, even those that seem contradictory. Only then can a person become whole and ready for awakening. When Jesus took the bread, blessed it, broke it, and said, "This is my body," he was speaking of more than himself. In the esoteric sense, bread symbolizes matter, the physical body, and the entire earthly experience of a human being. It is what we receive upon entering the world: flesh, organs, blood, the ability to act and to feel. In this understanding, bread represents life itself in the material dimension, with all its joys and trials. The wine, which he called his blood, symbolizes spirit, the energy of consciousness, the divine spark within us. In ancient mysteries, blood was always associated with the vital force, with that which nourishes and animates the body. Wine, born from grapes that have undergone fermentation, represents transformed, elevated energy. It is not merely a drink, it is a sign that the spirit must be activated and awakened. When the disciples partook of the bread and wine, it was not merely a memorial act. It was an inner union of two principles, the material and the spiritual. We see this same idea in the mysteries of ancient Egypt, where bread and beer symbolized body and soul, or in the Eleusinian rites of ancient Greece, where participants drank a sacred potion representing immortality. In the East, the same truth was expressed through the union of yin and yang, two opposite yet complementary forces. Jesus was giving his disciples not just symbols, but keys. He was showing that true life is possible only when spirit and matter are in harmony. Without spirit, matter is dead. Without matter, spirit cannot manifest in the world. And when a disciple partakes of bread and wine with awareness, he is not merely performing a religious ritual, he is engaging in an alchemical act, awakening the divine fullness within himself. Thus, in this simple-seeming meal, a great law was encoded. We are the bridge between heaven and earth, and only within us can their union take place. The story of Judas's betrayal is usually seen as a tragic episode, one of Jesus' closest disciples selling his teacher for 30 pieces of silver. But in esoteric interpretation, Judas is not merely a historical figure. He is an archetype, a symbol of that part of ourselves that resists the light and is ready to turn away from truth when the path becomes too difficult. The inner Judas lives in each of us. He is the voice of doubt, fear, and self-interest, the desire to remain in our comfort zone, even if it stands in the way of spiritual growth. He is the part that can reject its own striving toward the light, if that light threatens the familiar patterns of life. In the mystical tradition, an encounter with the inner Judas is inevitable. At a certain stage on the spiritual path, a person must face their own shadows, their fears, envy, pride, and all that they usually hide even from themselves. In the gospel story, Judas plays his role. He becomes the trigger for events that had to unfold. Without his betrayal, there would have been no passion, no cross, and no resurrection. From an esoteric point of view, betrayal marks the stage where the outer form collapses and the inner essence is put to the test. If one passes through it, they emerge from the darkness renewed. But if they try to avoid this encounter, they remain trapped in the illusion that the spiritual path is only light and joy, without pain or inner struggle. Thus, in the story of the Last Supper, Judas is not only the betrayer, but also the symbol of a necessary trial. His presence in the circle of disciples reminds us that on the path to awakening, we must accept and transform even the darkest aspects of our nature. Among all the events of the Last Supper, this moment is often overlooked, yet it carries profound symbolism. The Gospels tell us that Jesus rose from the table, removed his outer garment, took a towel and a pitcher of water, and began to wash the feet of his disciples. Outwardly, this appeared to be a simple gesture of care and hospitality, but in that time, it was highly unusual. Foot washing was considered the work of servants, and here the teacher performed it himself. In the esoteric sense, this act was more than a sign of humility. The feet symbolize a person's path, the way they walk, the direction they give to their life. To wash a disciple's feet is to cleanse their path from the dust and dirt accumulated along the way, to remove all that hinders them from moving forward in the spiritual sense. It is, in essence, an inner blessing for the journey ahead. In spiritual traditions, water represents purification and rebirth. When Jesus washed the disciples' feet, he was symbolically removing the imprints of their past experiences, freeing them from old patterns of thought and emotional blockages. He was preparing them for a transition into a new state of being, one in which they would become bearers of the light without his physical presence. This moment also reveals that on the path to awakening, pride cannot be preserved. A true master serves his disciples, and true power is expressed through humility. Jesus showed that spiritual greatness does not distance one from others. Rather, it draws one closer in order to help them move forward. When we gather together all the events of that night, the circle of 12 disciples, the bread and wine, the washing of feet, the betrayal of Judas, it becomes clear that we are looking at a carefully orchestrated, mystical drama. This was not a casual supper before tragic events. It was a rite of passage, an initiation in which Jesus was guiding his disciples to a higher level of consciousness. In the esoteric tradition, initiation is always linked to 3 stages: preparation, symbolic death, and rebirth. The Last Supper served as the preparation for the inner death of the old self. Jesus knew that his disciples would soon face a great trial, the loss of his physical presence, and would be forced to rely not on the outer teacher, but on the inner light. The fact that the supper took place at night is also symbolic. In the mystical sense, night is the time when the outer fades and the inner awakens. It is the space where darkness hides the familiar points of reference, and a person must begin to search for them within. The wine and bread were not mere symbols, but living codes, keys the disciples were meant to understand and embrace, so that they could later unlock their own spiritual power. The washing of feet cleansed their path, while the presence of Judas reminded them of the inevitability of confronting their own shadow. Thus, the Last Supper was the culmination of the disciples' journey with Jesus. It was the moment when he completed their preparation and passed on to them not only his teaching, but a state of being, an inner flame that would sustain them for the rest of their lives. Although the events of the Last Supper took place nearly 2,000 years ago, their inner meaning has not lost its power. The esoteric understanding of this rite can serve as a personal guide for anyone seeking spiritual awakening. The bread and wine remind us that we must unite matter and spirit in our lives, caring for the body while never forgetting to nourish the soul. The washing of feet teaches humility and the cleansing of one's path, so that we can move forward without the burden of the past. The presence of Judas shows that the encounter with our own shadow is inevitable, and that overcoming it is what opens the way to the light. We can hold our own inner version of the Last Supper. It need not be a religious ritual. It can be meditation, deep prayer, or simply a moment of stillness in which we consciously connect to our inner center, clear our thoughts, and release all that hinders us from moving on. In this light, the Last Supper is not merely an event of the past, but a process we can experience again and again. Each time we choose light over darkness, awareness over automatism, love over fear, we become participants in this eternal rite of awakening. We have journeyed through the events of the Last Supper, not as pages of an ancient text, but as a symbolic path of awakening. We have seen that behind the familiar words of the gospel lies a multi-layered rite, where every gesture and every detail carries deep meaning. In the circle of disciples, we found the reflection of all facets of the human soul. In the bread and wine, the union of matter and spirit. In the washing of feet, the cleansing of the path and the call to humility. In Judas, the encounter with the inner shadow, without which true transformation is impossible. The Last Supper reminds us, each of us is invited to our own inner table. It is the table where we meet our higher nature, cleanse ourselves of illusions, and receive the light. The path to it is always open. We need only the courage to take the first step. The awakening of the soul does not happen in an instant, but like the disciples, we can answer the call of the teacher, whether outer or inner, and one day realize that we are already seated at that table, and the supper of our soul has begun.